I think this is probably going to surprise you. I've been part of DEA as a prosecutor for decades. And the fact that I was female was really just a coincidence. I was in the DAG's office at Justice and was the liaison for the DAG's office to DEA and had that portfolio along with all of the DEA regulatory approvals and money laundering and asset forfeiture, and I was the director of OCDEF. So this was really part of me. It was a shock to me to be considered for the administrator position, not because I was female, but I wasn't political. I was a career prosecutor, and it was quite the surprise to me when the Deputy Attorney General, Larry Thompson, said, Karen, I think you should be the next administrator of DEA. And I just started laughing. It was just so surreal. Well, that was also extraordinary. Honestly, I don't know how the government gets people to go through that process. It's so torturous. So here I'd had a security clearance at the highest levels for certainly more than a decade. And to go through the confirmation process, I had to go back to age 16. And I was 49 at the time. I had to go back to age 16 and go through all of the residences and people who knew me back then, so that was a bit of a surprise. The process itself is what everybody goes through at certainly heading a federal law enforcement agency. You go before Congress. You have meet and greets with the members of the U.S. Senate committee, and you go before Congress. When I went, I testified for my hearing alongside of Chris Wray. Chris, at the time, he's now the FBI director. At the time, he was going through confirmation to be the head of the criminal division at the Justice Department. So we sat there side by side, and I reached back into some of my favorites in DEA leadership, and I reached out to Jack Lawn. And I asked Jack if he would come with me to the confirmation hearing. He did. I also asked him to speak after I was confirmed. We had a SAC meeting, and Jack was a featured speaker at that meeting. So the process was memorable. I was glad to get through it, and the best was all that came after. I was very fortunate. I am a hard worker. I over-prepare for everything. And I was recognized throughout my career by wonderful people who brought me along, gave me opportunity, and from different administrations. I was apolitical, and so I would say certainly Larry Thompson, the Deputy Attorney General in the Bush administration, was critical in terms of just opening my eyes to this possibility, and then advancing me as a candidate. And before that, Eric Holder in the Clinton administration, who I also worked for in the Deputy Attorney General's office. He also was, just like Larry Thompson, just a wonderful supporter, advisor, and connector of talent. No, there were so many compelling issues at the time. There, and you're talking about an agency that I thought of as racehorses at the gate, just opened my gate. Tell me where the finish line is, and let me run. And DEA is an agency that is built with extraordinary racehorses. I would say it's hard for any agency to have a series of acting heads versus a confirmed leader. DEA had a series of acting administrators. Asa Hutchinson was here for a short time and then moved over to leadership in the newly created Department of Homeland Security. So I was following a number of different short-term leaders, and there was a predictable brain drain that was about to happen at the leadership levels within DEA. I think more than half of the leadership was eligible to retire, and even getting close to mandatory. So there was going to be a lot of change, and all of that created tremendous opportunity. So on the drug front, when I came in, we were still very, very driven with cocaine, also marijuana, which was like a cash crop always, and methamphetamine had been sweeping the country and showed no signs of abatement at that time. Drug-endangered children in horrible meth lab conditions across this country, and the beginnings of what was clearly going to take us in a different direction with prescription drug abuse. So we saw internet pharmacies rising at the same time we were trying to get methamphetamine under control, at the same time that we were really coming out of 9/11. So when I became the administrator, we're talking at the 50th anniversary. I came in at the 30th anniversary. We had just come through such a somber period of 9/11 and its aftermath. So there was just that tough time for our country, huge shifts in drugs, and both in this country and with our international partners, and I would say the beginnings, the foundation for DEA to reach its zenith of what it always had done at its best. So I used to joke about this. Bob Mueller was the head of FBI at the time, and I remember going to a conference, and he had his top 10 priorities, and I thought, I have a top 7 priorities. So maybe when I grow in the job, maybe I can expand it to 10. I never did. So when I came on board, I listed my top 7 priorities. I won't go through them all here, but among them, it was on the drug organization side, really focusing on the disruption and dismantlement of entire drug organizations. It was the refocus on money laundering and asset seizure and forfeiture, really hitting hard on the financial underpinnings that fueled these drug trafficking organizations. It was a more robust, intelligence-driven, led targeting and enforcement piece, as well as I came up through my career in part through SOD when I was an attorney at the Justice Department. So it was about ensuring the partnerships that enable incredible cases to become extraordinary. Oh, so many. I was so lucky to be in the midst of truly the finest, most brilliant professionals, the DEA agents and staff and professional support for agents and intelligence analysts. So I was just lucky to be here at that time. So this is what DEA did when I was here. DEA had and still does have the most extraordinary intelligence, human assets around the world. Other intelligence that DEA was well known for. And after 9/11, where there were questions about intelligence failures, we had very candid conversations among the leadership in DEA. And I said, we can't afford not to take our intelligence and put that into the intelligence community. We have the best foreign intelligence. And so we returned as a member of the intelligence community. We were the 16th agency returning to that community during my tenure. The financial investigative teams. So when I was a prosecutor, I saw amazing, collaborative, partnered financial investigations that DEA spearheaded. And DEA returned to that day. Financial investigative teams were created. They were created in foreign offices, in the domestic offices, at headquarters. We created an Office of Financial Operations that resulted in ensuring that we hit that whole revenue side of drug trafficking. And when I came in, our asset forfeitures, not just DEA, across our partnered community of drug enforcement, was less than $500,000. When I came in, that was our best year. And by the time I left, with all of this focus on financial investigations, it soared to over $3 billion in recovered assets, seized and forfeited assets, and which also inured to the support of our state and local partners. And the best part was, I remember one day sitting and talking to the head of the Office of Financial Operations, Don Semeski, who I'd brought in from IRS CID. And I said, Don, what's it going to take for it to make a difference? What's it going to take for us to seize enough from these drug organizations where they won't just write it off as the cost of doing business? And he gave me a figure, and it was like telling me that we needed to run to the moon and back in an afternoon. And so I said, Don, we have to break that down. We have to be able to achieve this. So he came up with a strategy every year, year over year, how much we needed to seize that year to get to the point of hurting the drug organizations. We had a 5-year plan. DEA blew past it within 2. Setbacks. I'll tell you the most painful times. Wow, it makes me emotional just to even think about it now. I remember my first line of duty death. and that was Terry Loftus, who was part of DEA Aviation. And he was killed in his aircraft outside of Chicago. And a task force member, Jay Balchunas, the loss of Jay. And I remember after Katrina, I flew down, DEA Aviation flew me down after Katrina, and I oversaw the devastation after Hurricane Katrina. And then we landed in Mississippi, right across the river. And I'll never forget, that was painful to see the devastation, but extraordinary what DEA had pulled together. They were operating outside of a bank building. It was the only place that was semi-safe. They were operating in the drive-through, outside drive-through of a bank, local bank. There was a sign that was perilously hanging by one thread above them. They had basically an RV, and they were working with state and locals on gangs that were marauding that whole devastated area after Katrina. It was heartwarming. It was also heartwarming even in those low moments of the line of duty deaths, to spend time with the families. I loved these families, still do, and they really are kind of that backbone, heart and soul of this agency, of what everybody's fighting for, to not just protect the country and our partners, but to never forget the loss and what these families live through every day, having lost one of those people. And the moments where people were extradited, the killers of Richard Foss, the killers of Paul Sima and George Montoya, those extraditions, those are the sweet silver lining moments of the saddest times for this agency. Well, one of the first things I did when I was sworn in as administrator, the next month I flew to Mexico. And I had read Killing Pablo. And it was at a time, both in Mexico and Colombia, where for us to succeed, we needed them to succeed. And it was really tough times for extradition and corruption. And I flew to Mexico. I then followed later with a trip to Colombia, and I took two leaders in both places, my counterparts, the Spanish version of Killing Pablo. And I said to them, this is your future. This horrible period in Colombia is your future if we don't really work together. And we formed the most amazing partnership. Juan Manuel Santos at the time was a defense minister. He later became both vice president and president of Colombia. Eduardo Medina Mora was the head of public safety in Mexico. And the three of us became like a triumvirate. And it was the best of times for us trying to make headway. And part of that was really an impressive moment was DEA's creation of the drug flow attack strategy. And that strategy turned corruption on its head. It used corruption against the corrupt, fed them misinformation, enabled all of us partners to make extraordinary cases against these drug enterprises that have been operating with impunity. So that strategy was momentous. It was also at a time in this administration, in the Bush administration, where it was one of the first times, certainly that I can remember, that an administration said, this is what success looks like. They had actual numbers of the reduction of drugs in the workplace, the reduction of teen drug use, the percentage of reduction that they expected to achieve together, all of us together. So we had the supply reduction. There was certainly treatment and prevention, equally critical, but it was very clear what DEA needed to do on the supply reduction front. So we became strategic. We took our little resources and really developed amazing strategy, financial, attacking corruption and drug flows strategically, using extradition strategically with our foreign partners, and it really showed in the results. For the first time, DEA leaders were being measured by their performance was being measured by how did you move leads, tips and leads to the rest of the field offices, the divisions, to take out an entire enterprise, not just who was in your city. They were being measured on how much they were seizing and forfeiting. Everything came down to, did we make our contribution? Are we hitting the mark on these percentage reductions? We blew through it. And at the same time, we were the only law enforcement agency to have a clean financial audit, federal law enforcement agency. We also ranked in the top 20 of 222 federal agencies as one of the best places to work for among federal agencies. We were in the top 20. So in terms of workforce development and a sense of purpose and accomplishment, and everybody knowing what the end goal was and being measured by it, and being held accountable, it was an extraordinary time for production. Setting about to ensure the international partnerships was a priority. Because if we can't attack the drug flow at the front end of it, it's obviously much harder once it gets into the U.S. So those partnerships are critical. The partnerships with our state and local law enforcement partners was at a tough time. We have mobile enforcement teams across the country. Those were being defunded. At the same time that state and local partners were counting on that. And really through amazing leadership inside DEA, right before an appropriations hearing, where those teams, those mobile enforcement teams, were on the chopping block, we retooled them, and they became not mobile enforcement teams, they were meth enforcement teams. So working with our state and local partners to ensure that they had the support that they needed was essential. We even worked on the international justice side. I'll give you an example of that. In Israel, there was an ecstasy trafficker, a major ecstasy trafficker, who no one in Israel seemed to be able to touch in terms of bringing him down. We had the chance to do that here in the U.S., but it required some partnership with Israel where we worked with terrific U.S. attorneys. We worked with them. They worked out an agreement where we prosecuted him here, Zev Rosenstein, prosecuted him here. He got, I believe, a 20-year sentence, and he was sent to Israel to serve that sentence. And that was the only way Israel would extradite him to the U.S., is if we worked out this new agreement that he would serve the sentence in Israel. And so those kinds of creative partnership building at all levels were truly, that partnership building was truly a hallmark for DEA. Always had been, but we really took it to some amazing creative heights. During the time that I was administrator, we focused hard on the consequences of drugs, social, economic, personal, the workforce cost, and down to individual cost. That was probably the first time we had a full force focus on that. I think DEA is doing a tremendous job right now, and demand is something that will always be with us. I thought about DEA. DEA's always under some kind of attack for or criticism for not winning the so-called horribly labeled drug war. Who in law enforcement is ever under attack or criticism for not stopping murder, for not stopping robberies? DEA is the only law enforcement agency that somehow is expected to stop all drugs, even though that's been a part of our universe around the world since the beginning of time. So that said, when you talk about reducing demand, it is, DEA's got it right. It still has it right. The one pill can kill. Focusing on where the greatest losses are certainly with fentanyl right now. We didn't have fentanyl when I was the administrator. If we did, it was because it was legitimate medical use. It wasn't killing people from drug use. I will never forget Kate Patton standing up in front of a full auditorium of DEA employees. She lost her daughter, Kelly, to drugs. I will never forget her standing up and saying, "I wish you had arrested my daughter, because maybe she would have had a chance." That was earth-moving for me. And so when you talk about demand reduction, it is about supply reduction. It is about treatment. It is about DEA sharing its phenomenal intelligence, both with those grassroots community partnerships working against drugs, going out as DEA is doing beautifully to educate this country about where those risks are. And it will always be a challenge because so much of that is outside of DEA's control and will always be outside of DEA's control. But DEA will always have one of the most critical pieces, not just in supply reduction, but sharing the intelligence with the grassroots community prevention efforts so that they know the direction they need to go in based on the intelligence that DEA provides them about where the drug trends and flows are. I could never look back on my more than 40 years in drug enforcement support and leadership and public safety driven career. I could never look back on that without DEA being at the heart of what made my career the finest life experience and professional experience for me. And the men and the women in every part of DEA are really the crown jewels of drug enforcement in this country, on this planet. The men and women who suit up every day and blow through the criticism, the hurdles, and focus on delivering their finest performance every day are the best. So I have to share one of the great partnerships that we had in DEA during my tenure, and that was with DOD. After 9/11, the U.S. and coalition forces went into Afghanistan. DEA had been in Afghanistan well before, but had been out because of the country and losing diplomatic ties during the Russian invasion and after. So we had been out of Afghanistan. It was the heartbeat of opium heroin production. And after the U.S. and coalition forces moved in after 9/11, the embassy started to stand up, and DEA went back in. The partnership piece of that was just another example of DEA truly developing meaningful, real partnerships to tackle these tough organized crime, drug enforcement obstacles. So we created a partnership at between DEA and DOD. And DEA didn't have any money, but we have extraordinary people. And the embassy was standing up, and the decision was, but in this partnership with DOD, that while the U.S. military was stumbling over opium production labs and pieces of that production around the country, that was not their mission. And there was no force on the ground in our typical international relationships and partnerships. You're supporting your drug enforcement partners from that country, but there were none. So DEA worked with DOD, and what developed from that was that DOD would financially support and otherwise support the creation of the FAST teams. It was a strategy out of whole cloth where we didn't have our traditional pieces of support, but we had DOD. I still remember our men and women in DEA who were part of the development of that strategy. I went to the military base where they were training. The first FAST team was being stood up. It was all volunteer. You have to remember that the men and women in DEA, many of them joined DEA because they had seen Operation Snowcap featured on 60 Minutes. And these are people who had worked with DEA in other capacities. So we stood up these FAST teams from this all-volunteer force of DEA agents. They went to the military base, and I went to that base, and I will never forget standing in front of them and telling them, it's not too late. You know, I applaud you for volunteering. This is a dangerous, difficult mission. It will be extraordinary if we don't lose one or more of you in the execution of your mission. I asked them to consider this. And I said, it's not too late to back out. And there's no loss of face by deciding not to go. It was important to me that I, as the administrator, tell them how dangerous it was and that they would still be the same extraordinary agent if they decided not to. Not a single person crossed the line and said, I want to step out. Not a one. To the contrary, what was, I'll never forget, what was so just awe-inspiring was I think some of them had children that were about to be born, and they scheduled a C-section early so that they could see their children before they were deployed to Afghanistan. And while they were in Afghanistan, they were drug enforcement. They created their narcotics team on the ground. They worked under extraordinary difficulty. You couldn't move around in the country. We depended on DOD to help get us into the country, to move us around in the country. We didn't have aircraft in the country at the time. We would get on DOD ring flights where they would go around with supply flights to various coalition bases. And the magnificence of the partnership from between DEA and DOD and on the ground in what was a country with no infrastructure, a country with no transportation, a country with no counterparts for DEA to work with, where DEA had to create that. And in the creation of it, I will not forget, there were Afghan people who did not know how to tie a shoelace. They did not know how to do a jumping jack. You're talking about the most primitive workforce development that DEA probably had ever faced. And they were superlative. They had tremendous operations on the ground. And one of the greatest moments was to be able to reach out to the U.S. military and say, that intelligence that you just got from us, from DEA, is the source of intelligence that saved you from a rocket attack and an IED explosion. And it was true. We also, as a result of those FAST teams and that intelligence and that partnership, we also extradited the first Afghan drug leader, Haji Baz Mohammed, whose goal was to kill Americans with drugs. The first extradition wouldn't have happened without that partnership and without the fast teams. So that is a source of pride for me.